¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Ustedes saben que siempre hay temas en el mercado espacial que resaltan más que otros, ¿no? Y dependiendo de la circunstancia, del momento. Bueno, hoy por hoy hay un par de temas. Uno de ellos es las estaciones espaciales comerciales. ¿Se acuerdan que hace una semana yo estuve en Washington y estuve ahí en el evento Ignition o Ignición, ¿no? Donde la NASA presentó planes a futuro, la base lunar. Bueno, una de las presentaciones hablaba sobre las estaciones espaciales comerciales y cómo la NASA como que puso el freno diciendo, no nos arrepentimos, no vemos que exista el mercado que pensamos existiría a nivel comercial, por lo tanto vamos a nosotros a comprar, la NASA va a comprar e invertir en un módulo central, en un core module que se va a acoplar a la estación actual y después vamos a invitar a estaciones espaciales comerciales que se vayan acoplando a este módulo. Claro, y esto cambia las reglas del juego absolutamente otra vez para muchas de las empresas, entre ellas Axiom Space, Vast o Starlab, que tienen que estar corriendo siempre atrás de los cambios de reglamentaciones que la NASA impone cada 1 o 2 años. Otro tema es el de los trajes espaciales, que la NASA va a usar para sus astronautas para que bajen a la superficie en las misiones Artemis. Y hace un par de días nada más, la oficina del inspector general de la NASA emitió un informe en el cual medio como que levanta preocupación diciendo el único proveedor que hay hoy trabajando en los trajes espaciales es Axiom Space. Antes estaba Collins Aerospace y Axiom compitiendo, bueno, Collins se bajó y el informe dice, si algo le llega a pasar a Axiom Space, todo se va a demorar, claro, porque podemos tener el SLS, podemos tener la cápsula Orión, podemos tener el módulo de aterrizaje, pero si no tenemos los trajes espaciales, nadie puede bajar a la superficie. Y Axiom Space está también metido en esta discordia. Así que quise hablar con ellos, además porque es una empresa que se dedica líder en infraestructura en órbita baja de la Tierra, no solamente estación espacial comercial, el traje espacial que va a utilizar la NASA, data centers orbitales, manufactura en órbita, misiones tripuladas a la estación espacial. Así que tiene un montón de unidades de negocios y su nuevo CEO, Jonathan Cirtain, tiene un bagaje también muy diverso desde la NASA hasta el mercado comercial nuclear en los Estados Unidos. Creo que parece ser la persona indicada para manejar una empresa que está en tantas áreas de negocio diferentes. Así que hablé con Jonathan Cirtain, el CEO de Axiom Space, 20 minutos más o menos, ojalá lo disfruten. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to meet you. How are you? And thank you for giving me some of your precious time. I know you are, I guess, one of the hotspots in the industry right now because of all the things that Axiom is doing. So, how does it feel?
It's a pretty amazing time, both in my career and here at Axiom Space. So, really excited for what we're up to and what the agency NASA is up to. Artemis 2 was what an amazing mission that was. I was really delighted to get to participate in launch and witness splashdown remotely on the splashdown part. But
Yeah.
I worked at Marshall Space Flight Center in the mid 2000s, 2007 through 16, and worked on the SLS launch vehicle for a while. So it was personal for me as well. So just so many exciting things happening in space these days, and really grateful for the part that Axiom gets to play.
I saw you were coming from, maybe you don't have a profile for the typical space company CEO. You're coming from 9 years of NASA. Then you've been doing some nuclear industry, commercial activities. So is that telling us something about the profile? Because you're saying Axiom is like a microgravity research, space station, space manufacturing, the suit, of course, orbital data centers. Is that a requirement that you need to be in many fields in order to understand? Or is a particular case of Axiom that is involved in so many business?
It's a great question. And the short answer is yes. I am a broad brush technologist. I've been involved in a lot of different technology development programs. I think for the board of Axiom in particular, the attributes I have from my career experience and educational training that were of interest to them were that broad technology exposure, but also that I had scaled up technology opportunities at a company like BWXT from a few $1 million R&D program to a hundreds of millions of dollar capital deployment to build infrastructure for things, to overseeing large $500 million to $1 billion programs and companies. And then ultimately I was a officer of that publicly traded company. And so I had public trading company experience, I had CEO experience, I had technology experience. All of those things, when you stack them up, were relevant for Axiom's management expectations as the company scales up. So, needing to understand environmental control and life support is important, but maybe just as important is understanding how to scale up a company, understand the technologies, et cetera.
You started as CEO like a couple of months ago, or no, like last year? When was
6 months. October of 2025, I was CEO, but I was the president from June of last year through, and I still have the title president, but I've been with Axiom for about, just under a year now.
And you're coming in a moment where there's so much going on. I have many questions, but from the suit that Axiom is developing right now, that is basically the one that is going to use, NASA astronauts are going to use to go into the surface of the moon. I just was reading the OIG report the other day. And when you read the entire report, you can say, oh, maybe it's a little bit concerning that Axiom is the only provider that NASA is going to use right now, since Collins Aerospace withdraw from the competition. But then you see, you see videos like this, and I understand the relationship you have with NASA, the hours of training or pressurized, understand training with different astronauts. And I don't know, should we be worried, or I think we're okay?
So I think it's understandable that the OIG looks at these things and wants to understand risk from the standpoint of the agency's procurement and program execution. However, since that OIG report started and through today, Axiom's made tremendous progress, and Axiom's not doing this alone. Axiom's doing this in deep collaboration with Johnson Space Center. And so while there is some potential risk for the development of a new system like a spacesuit, it's risk that both Axiom, with our experience, with all the employees that we've hired that come from this background, to all of the experience at Johnson Space Center, we're a deep bench. And so it's a highly capable workforce with legacy facilities and systems at Johnson Space Center that we can leverage to make sure that we're managing risk well. So I appreciate the OIG and the need for these reviews. This is just part of the process of being a company that's working on, complex technologies with a national imperative. So I welcome that kind of review. I also am a pretty transparent person. I'm willing to accept the criticism, so all good.
So how is the relationship with NASA? Because I think you've been having this relationship for a long time right now, not only because of the PAM missions, the private astronaut missions, but also with this suit. They are like providing with the infrastructure or even buildings that you can do the test. So the relationship, I think, is going well.
The relationship is going well. NASA is our customer, but NASA is also our partner. It's the only way programs of this magnitude succeed is if the customer and the supplier are very well aligned. When the alignment isn't there, that does cause delay, that does cause challenge. And so Axiom and Johnson Space Center work very hard to make sure that we maintain alignment on a daily basis. And the consequence of that is daily we make progress. And we've been working this way for more than a year now in a very concerted effort to make sure that we're not having schedule challenge, that we're not having budget challenge. And the consequence is we'll deliver a qualification suit later this year, and we're prepared for Artemis 3 next year. It's a great feeling.
I was just going to ask you that. So you feel confident that for Artemis 3, the astronauts will be able to test the first, at least the first version of the xEVA suit.
That's right. Our plan is to provide NASA a flight suit for a demonstration mission next year, whether that's to the International Space Station or in collaboration with one of the human landing system providers, is something that NASA is yet to give us guidance on. Okay. But in either case, we'll be ready.
Let's talk about another business unit, the space stations. Maybe it should be the core business of Axiom was basically born for not having this gap between the space station, the International Space Station, and the commercial space station. I was in Washington during the ignition event, and I saw the NASA's presentation, and I understand that most of the players involved maybe don't agree with NASA that there's no such market as space stations. I saw some of the announcements between you, vast other players. How are we? What is the status right now? Because NASA says we don't see a market. The player says, yeah, we have a market. We do have a market. We are producing revenue. We are sending X amount of mission to the space station, and we are sure that we are going to have a market. So prove me wrong. How are you going to get together the different players to prove NASA wrong?
Well, it's a complicated situation. And by way of precedent, I'll explain the Axiom position. The commercial orbital transport system, COTS, that was started under President Bush in 2004, ultimately turned into the commercial resupply program, and then ultimately the commercial crew program. And commercial resupply and commercial crew support a market of NASA, right? That is the marketplace. The customer is NASA. The market is NASA. Now, there have been a few private astronaut missions where SpaceX has sold commercial crew opportunities to space. There's a couple of those, but the vast majority of the revenue SpaceX generates from human spaceflight is in support of NASA's commercial cargo and commercial crew programs. That's the market. In the case of space stations, that is also the anchor tendency and the market. The market is NASA for the human and other sovereign nations, frankly, for human transportation. That's the market. There's also additional market opportunity. So in the near term, while the market for human spaceflight is limited to mostly sovereign nations with the occasional private astronaut, there's an additional market that didn't exist. It doesn't exist yet, but it is on the verge of emerging, and that's a commercial research and development market for payloads that can go to a commercial space station. On the International Space Station, they can't convert research and development into commerce, but we can do that on our space station. And so I think there's some work to do between us and NASA to really hone in on the concept of market from the standpoint of who is the consumer of a service. In the case of the human spaceflight to the space station, the primary consumer of that service is nation states. That's the market. I would also argue, Manuel, that that's also the market for many types of helicopters and airplanes and autonomous vehicles and drones, and that's the market for those. There's sovereign nations that are buying that content. And that's a trillions of dollar per year market in the sale of those things to sovereign nations. So I think that ultimately, I think it was a difference in perception of what the intended use of the commercial space stations is, to then argue that there's no market for it, because there's a huge market for it. We've flown, 300 people to the International Space Station in 25 years. So that's a market right there. 300 people is a market in terms of spaceflight. It's half the number of people that have ever been to space.
Yeah. The entire Axiom business, or at least regarding to the space station, is that you were developing this PPTM model that is going to attach to the station. When you see the NASA's presentation, is basically they are saying, no, we're going to buy right now a core module. If I'm not wrong, this is basically the first element of the space station that Axiom is building. So is this designed for, say, okay, NASA, here you are. This is the core model you need, but we want to own it, not NASA to own it. So what happened if NASA says, no, we're going to buy the core model to another company? What is the implication for Axiom?
Well, we will work with the government to make sure that whatever the procurement strategy is that the agency decides, that Axiom can participate in that program. However, the business case for us always has been built upon the notion that we would build the commercial space station, we would build the modules, retain the intellectual property, and operate those modules on behalf of the customer.
Right.
If they change the concept of operations to include the government being in the loop, I would argue that undermines the commercial cargo, commercial crew, clips, these other commercialization of products and services that agencies worked so hard to create over the last 25 years. To switch now, I feel like would be problematic. However, architecturally, we're building the equipment necessary to satisfy the agency's technical objective, which is to de-risk the transition from the International Space Station to a commercial space station. And this increment approach to attach the module first to the International Space Station and demonstrate its operability, maybe kick the tires on its capacity to maintain human health and safety, et cetera. That incremental approach lines up directly with Axiom's intended concept of operation. We've always intended to incrementally demonstrate our space station. So from some standpoints, this alternate approach in the RFI lines directly up with our deployment model. The one caveat is we don't like the idea of the government buying our equipment, because we've invested a lot of money to date to build these things for ourselves, and converting that into a government-owned asset
Right.
undermines some of our commercial intent.
Another business, let me switch to, because you are in many different businesses. Another one is data centers. And I know everybody's talking about data centers in space. I had the chance to speak with Star Cloud as well. But I guess your approach is different. Correct me if I'm wrong. You've been already doing some tests, not only inside the space stations, but you have 2 orbital nodes already based on the Kepler constellation. Can you describe a little bit what's the difference between what companies such as SpaceX or Star Cloud or Google are envisioning with the ODC strategy that Axiom is pursuing?
Well, we're building our system on top of our mission operations backbone. Being able to operate space systems from our Mission Control Center here in Houston, Texas, is extensible into operating other types of spacecraft. In our case, many of the experiments that and human factors analyses that we want to do on our International Space Station or on our commercial space station require more compute than perhaps we're going to put on our space station. In particular, some of those science payloads may generate sufficient data that we would offload off of our space station into supporting robotic spacecraft that can do the compute work that these experiments are running on our space station. That's led to us testing out how we would extend our network of compute outside our space station so that we had an aggregated compute capability that we could use to support space station operations. And now we can expand that capability to other customers and provide them compute as a service. So it's a different construct from data centers.
Yeah.
We're really focusing specifically on the compute capacity and not on the generalized corollary of data centers in space to data centers on the ground. I mean, I frankly don't see us trying to run large language models on our compute system anytime soon, or other compute and data volume dependent products. That's not where we're focused.
So, Jonathan, the basic the business model in your case is to support the computing power to support first your own space station, and then if you have extra capabilities, you can offer that services for third parties or the government or other clients. Correct?
That's right. So other assets in space that need additional compute capability, we will coordinate compute time on our compute nodes to support that in-space compute capacity demand.
Are you a believer of this new wave of putting data centers in space? I had the chance back in the day in Argentina. I have worked several years, and in Mexico as well, in the first wave of data centers back in the Exodus times, when everything had to be outsourced, mission critical. Convincing CFOs, CEOs to outsource was complicated, was crazy. And now we are taking everything to space. Are you a believer that this is possible?
It's definitely possible. I do believe it's yet to be determined if the business case closes for these large constellations. But technologically, I don't feel like there's any impediment to the production of the spacecraft, the deployment of the constellations, the operations of the constellations, or the coordinated compute necessary to manage those constellations. I believe that is absolutely possible because of upmass capabilities that SpaceX and now Blue Origin and others are capable of providing. Rocket Lab is launching lots of spacecraft per year. And so infrastructure to space is no longer the impediment. Now we're looking for use cases to take infrastructure in space and generate benefit for people here on Earth. And I think that's where we'll see whether or not these business cases like StarCloud and Starlink close. Is there sufficient space to ground compute requirements that taking that work and moving it into space provides a customer benefit?
Jonathan, last question. I don't want to take more of your time, and I appreciate it. Your feedback regarding the space station or the future, assuming we have an Axiom space station in orbit, then flying solo at some point, how is the reaction of different countries to having, I want my own model, or Hilton, I want my own model? Do you perceive today a potential market that said, I can fill the space station with research, with manufacturing, with tourism? Is that possible in the upcoming years?
So to date, we've flown more than 160 science and research payloads, the 12 astronaut programs. We've had a full crew complement on the 4 PAM missions that we've flown to date. That data would suggest that there's plenty of interest in moving this from the International Space Station to a commercial space station. Furthermore, in the 25 years that the International Space Station's been doing this type of work, there's been more than 4,000 research experiments and no commercial conversion of those research experiments to some commercial product developed in space. That's a huge potential opportunity. And I think that is just scratching the surface. I think one of the things that Axiom's doing is through what we call the University Alliance. We're working with universities and industry throughout the world, including South America, including Argentina, and every continent except Antarctica at this point. We've got universities in our alliance, and we're working with them to create the ecosystem to understand the benefits of the use of microgravity as a research tool and convert that research tool, that resource, into a potential resource for a good or a manufactured product to be generated as a consequence of the access of that resource. So I think there's a lot there, but time will tell.
Last question. You cannot avoid this question. Have you ever wanted to be, or did it cross your mind, or being an astronaut, or you were never interested?
I applied twice. Peggy Whitson, who is my employee now, was chief astronaut at the time, and rejected my application twice.
How is that work relationship today?
It is a very cordial relationship because Peggy is a badass, and I don't want to cross her.
You're absolutely right. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy, but it was a pleasure exchanging some ideas with you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for talking
Thank
to
you.
me. Okay, take care.